I rushed everything last night. And finding speakers, tricky as usual. So please, if you have talks, or if you have a talk for tonight even, please submit them. So lightning talks, you've got David's talk to prepare. But let's get on with the show. So you were here. And what's happening in 2021? Well, we were going to have a meeting every month. Didn't happen, but we're back on now. Every second Wednesday, as usual. Even months at Karnov. I can't remember if this is an even month or not, but that's the usual agenda. We would love other venues to offer up their venues as well. So if you have a cool office, a nice space, big or small, just contact me or one of the other organizers and we can set you up. So yeah, like I said before, please come do a talk. We're a small group. It's nice not to see the same people speak again all the time. And you risk seeing me again if nobody submits a talk. So please, some talk ideas. Whether it is a long talk, a short talk, complex topic, simple topic, beginner, senior, there's always someone that will resonate with and is interesting too. So come chat with us. Also, we have a code of conduct. It's a good one. It's the Berlin Code of Conduct. Good example. No community is perfect. The goal is everyone has a good time. No one is excluded. If you feel that there's an issue, come talk to myself or someone else who has a yellow ribbon thing tonight. Also, feedback. Accessibility, food, dietary requirements, anything else. What can make these events better? But today, we are primarily going to be a social event, one talk. It's been a long time since anyone's seen each other, so I'm sure there are companies offering jobs, Karnov Group included as well, so talk to myself and others, mingle, see what's available. So our first speaker tonight is David.
First and last.
First and last, so over to David now. Thank you.
Perfect. So, hello Internet and everybody here. As Chris said, nobody wanted to do a talk, so I sacrificed myself for this, and I hope you will have a good time. And so I thought about like, okay, what should I talk about? And the first thing which came to mind, which was like the easiest thing to put on a few slides, was just like, you know, some daily tips and tricks what I do when I make a Rails code base. Yeah, so just like some practical examples of how you could structure or architecture a Rails code base. You know, a lot of things you should avoid, things you could do, and it's very opinionated. It's based on what I learned over the years and what I think is the best, and a lot of you might disagree with some of the things, and that's great because that's a good reason to make a talk next time about how you do stuff. So definitely do that if you disagree with me. I love to hear how other people are doing stuff in their projects. It's always interesting when you get a peek into someone else's project and see like, yeah, what they do actually, like what they do differently than you, and is it maybe better, or is it something you should try in your project? So it's a great motivation for a lot of stuff. The content, as I said, it's going to be like a lot of random tips and tricks in very random order. Some of them I took from our own guidelines we use in the project I work here at Karnov. Some of them are just ideas I would like to do in the future, or I think are good, or like things I do in the private, you know, my private projects when I start a new project. So yeah, it's a combination of all of these things. Yeah, a little bit about what I will be basing my talk on is. I joined Karnov nearly 4.5 years ago, and I've been working on one of the main products we have here, and it's very old code base. I was just doing some stats before this talk, and the first commit was in June 2011. The first PR was made in 2013, so before people were just merging into master directly, because they didn't think the PRs is a good thing. We have more than 40,000 commits, and a few weeks ago we have celebrated 10,000 pull requests. So it's quite large thing, and there's been around 57 different people who contributed to this code base over 10 years. So, and it has been the actual product itself has been rewritten like 2 or 3 times. So like changing the design, changing the whole structure of it. And the first Rails version I could find in the Git history was 3.1 and Ruby 1.9.2. We all know that version of Ruby. It's a scary thing. Some people are still running it these days, but yeah. But the good thing about our code base is that we like to keep it quite up to date. So the latest, we are actually on the latest version of Rails and on Ruby 2.7 and hopefully on Ruby 3 soon. So we keep the thing nicely updated. But as you can see from the stats, it's 10 years old Ruby code base, which went from all the upgrades you can imagine of a Rails version and a Ruby version, and 57 different people working on it. Few years of not using pull requests as a tool to merge things in. So you can imagine there's a lot of weird stuff. It's one of the most confusing code bases I ever worked with because everybody had a different idea of how to do stuff, and it changed a lot over the years. So there's a lot of anti-patterns you can find, and I based some of my talk on the things I've seen there, and I hope it will be useful to some of you. The current team setup, just to give you a bit of an idea of how do we work. We have actually 2 teams, around 6 to 7 people, 3 backenders, so I would say in total 6 backenders, Ruby backenders. Working on this. We have some open position in that. That's not the current setup. That's the setup we want to have. And there are some open positions in that. So feel free to talk to me if you want to know more. We also have 2 designers and UXers working with us. I'm currently a team lead / software architect for this platform. When I started on it 4.5 years, I was the only person working on it. And over the years, we scaled up to this setup. And basically, since I've joined, the journey was basically to move away from the full stack Rails application with a bunch of jQuery to Rails API only with React on the front end. And we are still in some of the transition of that. So yeah, that's what we've been doing last few years, and that's what we will keep doing for a little bit longer as well. Yeah, so this was just to give you a little bit of a background about what I work with on an everyday basis and where all these tips comes from. What's the background for it? Yeah, a few words about Rails. I mean, I love Ruby. That's why I'm here today. I have a kind of a love-hate relationship with Rails because there's a lot of great stuff, but there's also a lot of very bad stuff in Rails, and Rails is great in general, I would say. At the beginning, the beginnings are always easy. First half a year or year is really nice when you start a Rails code base, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, you found yourself in a very shitty position where everything you did at the beginning is now just coming back, and it's harder to change. It's harder to upgrade Rails versions. It's harder to upgrade Ruby versions because of the things you did at the beginning. So I will be trying to focus on a lot of things you should try to avoid, and a lot of them will be basically stay away from the Rails way of doing stuff. That will be really the theme of this topic. As I said, Rails tries to make a lot of things easy for you at the beginning, but the price will come later in general. So this will be somewhat a theme on the whole talk. So if you really love Rails ways of doing stuff, this is not a talk for you. So sorry about that. Yeah, all of the tips are kind of in a random order. I just wrote them as they came to my mind when I was preparing this talk. So let's jump to it. One of the few things which I always do when I start a new Rails code base is namespace everything from the beginning, especially controllers. This one. Let's look at some examples, right? Very innocent new Rails app. You basically start making controllers right away. You have an application controller. You're just smashing everything in. 3 years later, you find yourself, I need to add an admin module. I need to add an API module. I need to add an editorial, some kind of, someone who is not admin, but is some kind of external person contributing to your application. And you find yourself having so many different namespaces, and you end up in this weird state where a lot of your controllers are on like the top level, and then you have some namespace controllers. So what I find really good at the beginning when you start a new Rails code base, just make that namespace for your front end. Like in this example, I think I used an example front end. Call it whatever you want. Doesn't have to be called front end. Can be called public. Can be called whatever you want it. But start every Rails code base with some kind of namespace. You never know, in the future you might want to introduce the second version of your front end, different design, different things. So why not just start with the namespace right at the beginning? And one of the good things with doing this namespacing is that it leads you towards making your application controller smaller. Every namespace should have its own base controller, like in this example, right? You have a base controller for the front end, which leads us to kind of the second tip, which is try to avoid having application controller at all, or keep application controller as simple as possible and have like the semi-fat base controllers per namespace. The good example is here. Let's say we have an admin namespace, we have an API namespace, we have a front-end namespace. Keep base controller in each of them and try to put as much logic there versus trying to smash everything in the application controller from the beginning. And if you, for example, start namespacing from the beginning, let's say have a front-end namespace from the day one, then it will kind of force you to put most of the logic needed for your front end into a base controller, and your application controller will be very empty. And you can put a few things which are really reused between these three, but you can keep it very, very thin. Who here have seen a very thin application controller? Like that's the thing which in every Rails app, yeah, there are exceptions. But yeah, we all know how application controller ends up. 300 lines, 50 private protected methods, and stuff. So try to keep that separate. Even better thing is maybe, so this is the example, right? You have an application controller and then you would have a base controller for each of them. Or even better solution would be this. Don't use application controller at all. Have 3 different controllers, each of them inheriting from the action controller base, so there is no reusability for it. Well, someone could say, okay, but that's not very dry because I have a bit of repetition in different controllers. But I would argue that it's better to have the repetition there because you often end up with these application controllers which 40% of this code is only used for this namespace and 30% of the code is only used in that namespace. And then you end up with a really huge application controller. So maybe try to try it and see. I would say like bit of repetition in here is not a bad thing in this specific example. Yeah, that was one of the tips. The next thing is, yeah, sure.
Would you recommend factoring stuff out into modules?
I hate modules. But we will get to that. So I think if you had a shared logic, I would put it in a class. Let's say an authentication, or something like that. And some of the people, a lot of people doesn't know that you can actually pass the controller context as a variable somewhere else. So for example, you could pass self in a controller and then extract all the logic in an actual class, right? So then you just pass self, and then you can use all the kind of other controller methods you could use in that sense. Yeah.
So your front-end API and admins, are they all modules or classes?
So this would be controllers, classes.
Okay.
Yeah. And let's say if there's a bit of reusability in those, I would just duplicate them in a different ones. Because so usually when you have this, you shouldn't have this. If you want to have an API, you should make another application just for the API. If you want to have just admin module, it should be separate application. And if you structure your application from the beginning like this, it will be way easier for you to extract it in another app if you want it in the future, because there will not be that much coupling with the rest of the code base. Okay. Another small thing is pass instance variables to templates as local variables. What do I mean? We have an example here. A lot of people does that, right? This is the Rails way of doing stuff. And then instance variable, the user instance variable is available everywhere. And this is again, I think this is one of the biggest anti-patterns in programming in general, is using global variables which are accessible from everywhere. So what I would do is I would specifically pass it on as a local variable, as you see on the top example, and then in your template you use it like this. And let's look at a few examples how this can go really wrong. This starts getting really bad when you start using partials, because when you have an instance variable, people stop passing them on correctly into a partials. So we have here on the second code example, we have a template for, let's say, use as show, and we want to, let's say we extract the header of the user profile into a partial called profile header. And what some developers would do is, well, I have an instance variable, I don't have to pass it on, it's all global, right? So they would just start accessing the instance variable here in their partial. And here is the issue that the real flow is here, passing on variables down as you need them. You skip that step because you rely on the global context, that everything is global, that you can access everything. And this makes this partial profile header unusable anywhere else. Let's have an example. Let's say we have a playlist. So this is the example how it, I skipped one slide. This is an example how it would look if you passed on the local variable. You always have to explicitly pass it on to every partial down the road, but that is the reality. You actually have to pass it on. The fact that everything is global and available to you, that's the Rails magic, but I think it causes more troubles down the road than benefits. And here's the example. Let's say we have a playlist controller, and on the playlist page we want to show a header of a user who made the playlist. So of course, we have a profile header partial, let's reuse that, but it relies on user being set as an instance variable. So what people would do is they would go back to their controller, make it worse by setting an instance variable, which then gets somehow magically appears when you want to reuse the template for the profile header. And this kind of leads to these weird things where, if you have the structure, this template is using this partial and this partial, you rely on things defined like very high up the tree. And I've seen these things going really bad in many cases. So how would it look if we were to do it by passing things specifically? So again, we pass the all the variables directly from the controller, and then we pass it on when we pass the partial. It's a bit more lengthy. It's a few extra words you write on, but I think the benefits of this explicitly specifying and passing on parameters comes more handy in the future for you, and it makes the actual partial itself a little bit more reusable. Another thing, so let's say you really love those instance variables and you cannot live without them. You can still make it work, but then I would say at least don't use controller instance variables in your partials. You can still have it in your controller, but when you render a partial, always pass it on. You could also go around that again if you cannot really live without those instance variables in your controllers. Oh, sorry.
Maybe you say that because, like the first part, right? Like skipping the controller instances, not passing them to the view.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I'm not sure about how it's useful, because the rule of thumb I learned in the bootcamp, so I'm commercialist person, is that basically it's totally okay to add whatever and pass it on to you, because that's what it's for. But as soon as you're in partial, only variables.
Exactly.
And I think it hits the right balance.
Yeah.
But then I'm not sure then why, because if that's the main, and it sounds like it's the main tip, right? Like making sure that your partials are reusable. Then I'm not sure what benefit we get from skipping instance variables from the controller to the view if it's only just to the view.
One cool thing is that the value is never null, but it's a name error.
Come again?
So in the case when we stripped the user instance variable from the playlist controller, we keep doing it, and we have a thing. If we do at user, it's just nil. We have a hard time finding what that meant. But if we remove the at sign, it's a name error.
Right.
And we get some tips from the view code
right.
to the debugger.
Yeah. And actually, in one of my next tips, because they're actually kind of built on top of each other a little bit, we'll talk about not even passing that and passing something else into the view. That's one of the next tips. So we'll actually slowly start building on some of them, but you are getting to somewhere. But as you said, it's if you at least follow the rule that when you have a partial, always pass on the parameters, then it's also a good rule. It's livable.
Question.
Yeah.
What if you have to loop over the value, like playlist.user, and you have some sort of loop where you have to access it 10 times, for example?
So you mean the playlist would be, the user would be like an array or something?
Yeah.
We'll get to that actually. That's another step, because I don't think you should pass active records directly to a template. You should pass on a view objects, and we'll talk about view objects in a few slides. So let's see if that answers your question.
David, could you move the cursor? It's driving me crazy.
Do you like the background of the presentation?
I love it.
Yeah,
It's perfect. I stole it from the Ruby website. Yeah, this was a small tip which I think I actually wanted to delete in the end, but then I think I kind of left it. So I actually forgot about this one. Prefer private accessors unless a variable is used outside of your class. Good example here. A lot of people would write the attribute reader right on top of the class, but you don't need user for anything in this example. Then make it private. By default, I always, when I write attribute reader, I write private attribute reader by default, and then if I really need it outside, then I will move it out. A lot of people do this by default and make everything public, which, it's not a bad practice to just keep your things public if they don't need to be. So this was a small tip in between. There's
There's a gem that basically writes that the initializer and the private adder reader for you. I think it's called adder extras, which I can recommend if this is a pattern that you like.
Yeah.
The title of the book.
It's good to know. What is the name again?
Adder extras, I think.
Okay.
Haven't
Can,
been to Ruby in a long time.
Yeah, we can check it out.
I believe it's implemented in Rust for performance reasons.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
maybe quick question. Can you go back a bit?
Yeah.
What's the upside of just not using in the full name method just the instead like the @user?
Where? Sorry.
What value do we get from not using in the method the full name?
Yeah.
@user first name plus @user the last name. Like what do we need in this particular case attribute reader over here?
That's actually not a huge benefit
Okay, cool.
in that, but I prefer to use that. It's a preference thing. As I said, a lot of these things are very opinionated, so actually.
I think it's also the same as the other one, right? You get a name error instead of just something colon nil.
I think if you really want, you could perhaps delegate that attribute to something else if you have a separate presenter for something else as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's to make like future refactorings you might make easier, so you don't have to replace the
Yeah.
add sign everywhere. It's just sort of automatic
Yeah.
done. Right?
Sounds good, but it also conflicts with something I've been told to not code in advance too much. So it's a trade-off.
Unless you're making your namespace as the very first thing again.
Sorry for interrupting.
No problem. It's a lot of great input, so definitely keep it coming. So next few tips, I just wanted to give a little bit of a notice that they are basically based on the fact that you should separate Rails and your business logic as much as possible. And next few tips we will see, this is like very simple example of, you have some code, you have Rails, right? It's a framework. It's a tooling. It's a tool, right? It handles requests for you. It lets you run tasks. It lets you do migration. It gives you a lot of tooling around it. And then you have your own logic, like your own code which you write. And, I think you should try to keep those two as separate as possible. So put all of your code you can outside of Rails into pure Ruby classes, and then just reference them in the few places you need to. And this will be a theme for the next few tips we'll be talking about. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a disclaimer of, trying to keep your Rails code and your business, your product code, related code as separate as possible. And here we're getting to a tip which some of you talked about. Always pass on only one object to your view templates, either a presenter or a view object. What does that mean? Let's look at this example. We have our playlist controller, we have a show action, we'll find a playlist by an ID, and then we will pass on a local variable called playlist show view object. Or we will, I shorten the names to FE instead of the front end, just to so it fits on the slides. And yeah, or in this example, we'll just pass on the presenter if we had. What is the difference between a presenter and a view object? A lot of people might disagree. This is, again, my definition of it. Presenter presents single object. View object or model presents whole view, may present several objects, and might use several different presenters. And this is my example of it. So down here we have a simple user presenter. It takes the user object and has some kind of presentational method, let's say full name, where you concatenate first name and last name. It's as simple as it gets with the presenters. Here we have a little bit more complicated use case. This is a playlist show view. Imagine a playlist landing page. You want to show songs, you want to show who made the playlist, and you want to show some information about the playlist. In this case, you need some page title, and let's say we want to use two different things, right? You want to say, let's say the playlist title by and the owner's name. That should, for example, be the page title. And here you can reuse several different presenters, right? You can have a playlist owner, which is basically a user presenter. You can have a songs, which is an array of presenters. So you can basically nest a lot of different presenters in this view object. And instead of using the direct Rails models, active record models, you can basically make these small presenters for each of the stuff. And this is my difference between the view object or view model, depends how you want to call it, where it presents the whole view. So instead of using a lot of Rails helpers and passing on directly the active record models, you use this kind of small wrappers on the top of them. Let's look at some example. You can also use this for JSON views. Personally, I haven't used a JSON view template for years. I would prefer to write a pure Ruby object. And again, you can reuse different presenters, and each of the API presenters needs to implement the method called sjson. So then you can chain them. For example, here with the songs, this is good examples. You could have you will basically just create a presenter for each song and call sjson on it, and yeah. And on the other side, we can see how you would use it basically in your controller. You create this view object, and then you just say directly render JSON view object as JSON. You don't need any templates. You don't need any JSON builders. Simple Rails. I mean, hashes in Ruby are very compatible with JSON, so you can basically reuse that. Yeah, this was about the presenters and the view objects a little bit. Another thing is don't use Rails helpers, use view objects and presenters instead. So everything I showed you, if you ever needed to use a Rails helper, you could replace it by that. It could be a method in your presenter, or it could be a method in your view object. I don't have any code examples because it would literally be what you've just seen. Yeah, full name would be a good example. You could make a Rails helper called full name. You give it a user and it does the concatenation for you. But I would rather put it in a presenter or a view object instead. Yeah, another one. Don't use active record records directly in your views. Always wrap them in the presenters or other presentational classes. And what I mean by that is, very simple example, a lot of people would put the method called full name into a model. And that's how you end up with 2,000 lines user model in every application. Basically, because this is presentational logic, for me at least. And I would rather put it in the user presenter and just have it there. Instead of the model, it will make your models a bit smaller. And I mean, user model is the one which always gets the most crowded. We all have seen that, I guess. Yeah, I had another example here. So one could argue, what if I need to use the full name in both my API user presenter and my front-end user presenter? And again, here is where I would say duplication is better than the abstraction. I would rather have the duplication in both presenters than because a lot of people would use the user model as the abstraction of it to be used for the shared code, and I would just rather have it duplicated in two places. And I would rather have my my biggest problem when I will be changing this code to change it two places than to figure out some weird abstraction someone did and where the full name comes from. So I will just duplicate it.
Do you have any rule of thumb of when do you decide that is only presenter?
No, not really. I mean, you could again then try to you could extract this like common things into another class if you wanted, but nothing strong. Really.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Just to make sure, the reason you're using user presenter is to avoid inheriting all that stuff that comes from inheriting from application record?
Yeah. Because it's a presentational logic. What does the full name has to do with the database model? Why would you put it in the database model? Like, does it have to do anything with the database? Are you storing the full name there, or are you validating it? You don't need that, right? And that's one of the common things that people think they can only put logic into models, controllers, and views. But there are a lot of other classes you can put it on, and yeah. Why pollute your database model? Right? Database model should care about validations, database validations mostly.
So if you do want to do validations, how would you do that from the user presenter class?
I wouldn't. So validations I would keep in my active record model, because like validate that the first name and last name is not empty.
So you're spreading the concept of the model of user over two classes, the one or two domains, the one that inherits from application record.
Yeah, so the full name is a calculated value, right? And I want that value because I want to use it somewhere. And I want to use it in my HTML views. And let's say I want to use it in my API response as well. So I would put it where it's used. It's that. Never put logic into rake tasks not off. That's a typo. Or jobs or workers. Jobs, workers, rake tasks should only pass on parameters and maybe verify that the mandatory parameters are present. I took this. This is a snapshot of one of the older rake tasks we have. It's called import document prices. As you can see, there's a lot of stuff going. This thing does not belong to a rake file. This thing belongs to a pure Ruby class, and your rake file should just call that class. Again, how do you test a rake file?
With difficulty.
Exactly, right? So again, keep what is your code in a pure Ruby class. It's easier to test, and then just reference them in your rake task. Same thing for the jobs or workers, right? You should maybe verify that the file name is set, but I think actually rake task does it for you. I'm not sure right now, but like verify that the mandatory parameters are there. Maybe raise an error and then pass it on. That's what I would do in this. And yeah, this applies to jobs, workers, rake tasks. I think that's it pretty much. This is somewhat like a concept we're playing around in our code base, and that's basically where do you put the controller logic, right? Put them into something I call action objects. And what we do basically is we have this naming convention that every action object follows the following pattern, right? You have a namespace, the controller name, action name, and then the hard-coded word called action. So let's say we have an API users show, then you have API users show action. And for example, articles index action, or user favorites create action. And basically, this is to keep your controllers small. So basically, you put all your logic of your controllers into these things. They can erase error, and we play with the idea that they should always return a view object back to you. Let's look at an example. This is a little bit modified example from one of our apps. We have the documents controller. We have a show action. We made a special action object for it called API documents show action. It takes a lot of parameters. It has some throttling service, which is basically some anti-fraud detection if someone starts scrolling too much. We have some activity service. We have some document API. We pass the params. We pass on the current user. And then here you can see we basically run the action. We get the view object back. and then we return the view object as JSON. And this is basically what most of our actions in the new code in our app looks like. You instantiate an action object, you return a view object, and then you pass it on to a render function. As I said, we are moving from a full stack Rails to a API mostly, so then we don't really do that much an actual HTML view object. So most of our actual view objects are just returning JSON. So how would this kind of object work? I think I can scroll here. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I removed the initializer because we don't need it for this example. There are a few things to do, right? We want to raise an error when document was not found. We want to fail when user doesn't have access to an error to a document. We want to register the activity with the activity service. The throttling service might also want to do some stuff to verify that the user is not crawling us. So in that case, this could fail as well. And then we return the view object here down here. And yeah, here we just basically fetch the document from an API. And here we do some check on the document access. Imagine if all of this code I had to put in my controller. And imagine this is just one action in my controller. Imagine I have 5 or 7 actions in my controller, and I have all this code. Like you have a 250 lines of code in your controller, and it's just so hard to work with, right? So basically, you are not dependent on Rails. The code I showed you, there was a pure Ruby class. You are not dependent on anything from Rails. It's easier to unit test. You can use the spec helper instead of the Rails helper. In our project, it's very old and big. If you want to run one spec file with a Rails helper, it will take you 9 seconds to load all the files. So it's good to be able to use the spec helper when you can. Again, Rails upgrades are in general easier. One of the biggest problems with the Rails upgrades is that you have a lot of code in the Rails code. Right? You have a lot of code in your controllers, you have a lot of code in your models, in your views, and you're unsure. You need to go through all that code and make sure it works. If you try to move all your code into pure Ruby classes and then just reference them in your Rails code, like upgrades becomes way easier because you have this higher level of certainty that you're not relying on something which is in Rails because it's pure Ruby classes. So then you can it becomes a little bit easier to do the upgrades. Personally, these classes for me are not meant to be reusable. It is meant as a one-to-one representation mapping between the controller and an action. I don't. If you want to use 2 very similar actions, I wouldn't reuse the action objects. I would just extract the things into a common service. So in this example, activity service or the throttling service or the document API, this is something which could be shared by other actions. So that's why we extract it to a service. But I wouldn't reuse the same action object in 2 different controller actions. I think at the beginning when we started with this, one of the developers, we had a show action and an index action. And what he did was basically in the index action, he called the show action for all the results. And it wasn't really right. So index action has a lot of similarities with that, but then we would just extract the shared logic into services. In this example. Any question about that? Okay. Now that we have extracted logic from Rails, helpers, controllers, rake tasks, jobs, workers, and we have cleaned up the views with the view objects and presenters, the only thing we have left is the models and active record. We also extracted a bit of that into presenters and the view objects, but it was more like the presentational logic, right? There's still a lot of things happening with the active record models. And here I would advise you to treat all your database models as if you needed to extract them into another API or service later. Like this happens all the time. You start your app, in the future you want to start making a second app, but you need to reuse some data which is already in the first app, so you start extracting some tables from this app into a shared API service, right? And it happens all the time. So if from the beginning you start treating every database model and table you have as something, this could potentially come from an external API instead of directly from the database, example, let's say we have some index action. Let's say it's an API call which gives you all your colleagues. So basically we filter the user table where company ID is same as my company ID, right? That's how you get your list of your colleagues. Let's say you want to share something with them. What I would write is this instead. I would move this to something called data services user, and I would make a method there, colleagues of user, and I would wrap the whole active record queries there. So then in your services, you can just write it like this. This doesn't tell you anything that there's a Postgres database behind, right? You don't know what's behind. Like, there could be MongoDB, this could be whatever, this could be any kind of database, external service. You don't know that, right? But if you wanted to extract these tables out, all you would have to go is to go here and change those things around and what it returns, and it will make your move easier. I'm not saying it will be like this without any problems at all. This kind of extractions are always problematic, but it will make it a little bit easier as if you don't spread all the active record and Postgres and SQL related helpers from Rails all over your code base. If you try to keep them extracted like this, it will be a bit easier for you. Again, not great, not like totally easy, but you will see the benefit of it, I think. Another example of the same thing, basically, same for the create action, right? Let's say I want to create a record of user favorite document, right? It's a table which has a user and a document, and you create a record there. You can do similar things there with the create actions as well. Yeah, just an example. Another tip is only use Rails default controller actions. Another typo, sorry. Never use the custom ones. And for this, I will not talk as much. There's this amazing talk, Adomas recommended when we went to the RailsConf together a few years ago. It's great talk. The guy talks basically about how you basically create a bad code just by not following the RESTful recommendations of Rails. And I think you should watch it. It's like 40 minutes. It's a really good talk. And I will not go too much deep. I'll just try to pick up a few points from it. This is, as I said, in our code base, we have a lot of old parts, and now we are migrating into the API. This is how part of the routes file looks. It's a mess. Like, when I see this, when you see a lot of strings, you know something's wrong in the routes file in general, right? Like, this is nothing default Rails convention following at all. This is how our routes file looks for the new stuff. If you're not using the word resources or resource, you're doing it wrong, I think. One of the points of the talk basically is how people think about resources and the actions. And basically, you always use this convention where you have a noun and a verb, right? Noun is your controller, that's your resource. And then you have the verb, what you want to do with it, and those should be the default Rails ones. Few examples how you can turn it out. Very common. You have a user's controller and you want to have an action which updates a password. People would make an action called update password. But this doesn't follow really the convention, right? Because you end up with noun, verb, noun. And that's wrong, right? So what you could do instead is you could make user passwords controller and have an update action there. Because the resource you are updating is a user password. And then you can just use the default Rails action called update. Another example we had in our app, we had a user favorites. And of course, everybody loves drag and drop. And how those libraries works usually is that they will send you a new order of an IDs. So what would you call that action? At the beginning, I think someone started to write user favorites, and then they made the custom action called reorder. But again, what is the actual thing we're updating here? We are updating user favorites order. You would create a controller, that's your new resource, and again, you use the default Rails noun called update. And I bet you that you can transform every controller to this format. And it will be more cleaner, and I think you also, you'll end up with better code in general. Who wants to have 15 custom actions in your user's controller, right? But again, watch the talk. It's really good. The guy go deeper into the problems, but it's really good yeah, good tips he gives you there. It's a 40-minute talk, so of course he can go deeper into the problem. Yeah, and that was most of the actual like small tips I came up to talk about in the short time I had to do this talk. And at the end, I just wanted to share with you a bit of our code guidelines. We have them on GitHub. Rajesh is one of the persons who keeps them up to date a lot in our team, and just wanted to share with you. It's an example of common agreements we have. I didn't put all of them, it's just like few examples you can do. Basically the format we have is we have some keywords, which we use, for example, must, prefer, may, avoid, or never, and then we use those words to kind of describe how we want to do things. Example, never put logic in array task or jobs. That's one of the tips I would give you, so actually I took it from our guidelines. And then we use never. Don't do that. It's a rule. We agreed on it as a team. Don't do that. Avoid logic in class initializers. We haven't talked about that tip. But again, keep your initializers simple. We had once an initializer where someone would make a API request. It's not a good thing. It's harder to test and yeah, more error prone in general. Prefer named parameters in initializers. Use namespace for namespacing classes. Avoid nested classes. It's not much about the actual tips. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an example of what do we have there and how you could structure yours in your team, right? Sometimes some of these things are, no, it's not like some of them are really good and some of them are really bad. It's about the agreement. It's about like agree that, okay, we do it like this, so then we don't have to spend discussing this in a pull request. Some common rules, you must use the prefix for describing instance methods and dot for the class methods in tests. That's also a very common agreement. You should use, that's a typo again, sorry about that. So the block messages of your specs should construct a meaningful messages, right? So show action for non-existing users raises not found error. I can read it as a sentence, so it gives sense, right? Another rule. Your it block should make your assertions right. For example, renders correct cookie, because you expect a correct value. So try to small rules like this. We don't use control specs. We use request specs. We don't add feature specs or system specs, which spawns across the different requests. For that, we use our front-end libraries we have for end-to-end testing. We always write factorybot.create instead of create. Again, it's not important, but it's good for the consistency that you agree how you write it. Avoid stubbing private methods. Don't test private methods. Allow any instance of. Prefer only one assertion per test. Like a lot of the small things. As I said, it's not much about like going deep into those specific rules, but just like an example how you could write down rules for yourself, for your team, and it's all about agreements. Yeah.
What about the factory bot? What does it add or?
Nothing really. So by default in Aspect, there's a helper called create, so you don't have to reference it, but you can just also use the factorybot.create. And some people were doing it like this, and some people were doing it like this, and we're like, okay, so do it like this. Yeah. Again, just for the consistency. Yeah. No special meaning in that, yeah.
But then you're going to end up writing I18N in front of every T helper, and
if we agree, no, so we don't have actually the agreement. We should talk about that. What we should do with that one. Like, yeah, it's about decision, right? Okay. You had a question?
What's the difference between a spec helper and a Rails helper?
Rails helper includes the whole Rails. Spec helper only includes the file you are testing.
Right.
So it's it's 0.0.0.0 something seconds, and as I said, in our code base, since it's very big, it takes 9 seconds to load the files. Unless if you cache it with different tools and stuff, you can get it down to a better time. But yeah.
What's your end-to-end front-end library?
We were using Cypress a bit, but we stopped doing that now, and we moved to a service called the Ghost Inspector.
Ghost Inspector.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Check it out. No referral bonus for me, but yeah. And some rough summary. Basically, most of the things I've been talking about are based on few assumptions, right? And those are basically Keep strict separation between what is framework responsibility and what is your code. Reduce the logic in the Rails code bases, in the Rails related files like controllers, models, views, workers, and stuff. Explicit is better than implicit. Remember that your code is read more often than it is read. Another typo. Then it is changed. Was what I meant to say. And it's basically easier sometimes to explicitly write what is happening. Pass on the variables explicitly, specify. Where does the code come from? Don't just use the global, magically defined things around, because when next person comes, it will be way harder for them to figure out where does it come from? Or what's happening here? So try to be explicit as much as you can. Less relying on the Rails magic, global variables. And as I said a few times, repetition, I think, is better than wrong abstraction later, right? Dry code leads to abstractions. And those abstractions are often wrong and harder to read. So sometimes I like to say, if my biggest problem is that I have to change this in 3 files, that's a simple problem to have. If I have to figure out how the abstraction with 4 parent classes and 5 modules works, that's harder to do. And I would rather have the problem of changing the same thing in 3 files, because that's a simple problem to have. But a lot of developers like to make themselves the big problems of making a lot of abstractions, right? That's it. I don't know how long this was, because I haven't tested that. Oh, fuck. Sorry. I think it was nearly an hour, so I'm sorry about that. But any questions or feedback? Yeah?
Can you go back to the must never? That one. There is this thing about don't test private methods. Is it that you hate private methods and you want to make them as small as possible? Am I correct?
I love private methods. Most of my methods are private. No, okay. What is the meaning of public and private? By saying something is private, you tell the consumer of your class, this is not safe to use. This is my internal method I use for something, and it can change without me letting you know. And that's how also a lot of libraries works, right? When they change an API of a library, they will tell you how the public methods changed. All the internals of it, that's up to a developer. Like, I can do whatever I want in a private method. And it's not meant for anybody else to use outside. So why would you test something which is not meant for everybody to use outside? Because what's meant for everybody to use outside is your public methods. So you need to have tests for those. Because that's what people will be using outside.
Yeah, but I mean, okay, I guess it's a like your mindset, but I mean, when I hear the word private method, I think of something that, yes, you're correct, it's not meant for public usage, but then it also might be a series of things that they could tie in some logic that you would like to test in a unit test.
But that will be tested by your public method, right? So let's say I have a public method which says, actually we had a great example of that, right? In the one of the view models example I had. I just don't remember where it was. I think it was here. Nope. Can I find it? I just don't know where I put it.
Just, often I found in that situation that maybe meant that the private method should be another object. And then you can test the public interface in another unit test.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's a sign that there's too much responsibility, and there's a question of architecture to be investigated.
So this is a great example, right? I have this method called here document access, which checks this if user subscriptions and the document subscriptions, if there's any overlap. So basically, then user has an access, right? It's a private method. I'm not going to test that private method. But what I'm going to test is the run method. And I will make the setup in which this will be false. And then I will test that it erases this error. But I'm not testing that method. I'm still testing the private method. But I'm testing what changes in that private, like the actual outcome from outside, right? User have access, user doesn't have access. But I'm not testing the actual method down there, right? I'm testing it from a public interface, right? If you have a class, what consumer of that class sees is only the private methods. And that's what you want to test.
Public.
Public, sir.
But then in this case, you will, if it fails for some reason, your document access method, you will know that it fails, but you will not know why it fails, because you're testing the method that caused the method.
Yeah, but I know which file failed, right? So then I just go to file and investigate in a way.
It would be great to have tests for every single method, but it comes at a price, and it just makes more sense to test the public integration.
There's a really good video from Sandy Mans about testing. I'll definitely post it if you want in a chat. And again, it's a 50 minutes talk about, and she goes deeper into the problem.
She also says that she sometimes tests private methods.
Yeah.
It sometimes. Makes
Sometimes.
sense.
Rules are meant to be broken.
Exactly. Did we say never or avoid?
No, it was just.
I'm just curious. What is it?
And it says don't test.
Avoid stuff.
This needs to be two rules.
Yeah, avoid. Okay. Next revision is coming. Anything else?
Yeah, have you considered separating the controller action classes into something that has no idea about controllers? For example, business requirement comes in and says, we're not using web, this is a command line interface now.
Yeah.
So then you forget all about controllers and try to do like, this does
Yeah.
that, this does that.
But that would just be renaming of the class, right? Because there was nothing action specific, right? It just
Depending on how things are big or small, how many things are happening in a single controller action, because usually it will be one thing, but sometimes, depending on what the application is doing, there will be multiple things. And then you have like basically a free CLI version of your application. Just sometimes, most of the time, it happens to be a web application instead.
Yeah.
So you can remove all the networking considerations, all of that, and set much pure. Have you tried any of that?
No.
Okay.
No, actually. But it's one of the right options. It will be easier, right? Let's say we want to move to Sinatra.
Yeah.
I could take my action class and put there, change few things, maybe the params, right? I don't know how params are passed in Sinatra right now. I don't remember from my head, but yeah, you could easily pass. It's a hash, right? At the end of the day, it's a special hash in Rails with some restrictions on it, but yeah, it will be easier to move. Or like, as we talked about, no logic in array tasks, right? So if you passed on some parameters in array task, I could maybe run the same class as well. It's mostly about naming. Set me free, please.
Thank you to David for the nice long talk. Questions are not over, of course, so we have more time here until 8 o'clock to keep eating food, keep drinking, and then we usually find a local brewery of some sorts or cocktail bar. Yeah, brewery, yeah. So whatever you like, find some friends, keep talking. We're asking David about guidelines and code. He really likes it. And we need a new venue for next month. So if you have a venue, please offer it up. And we also need new talks. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming. And we will see you next time. And I probably forgot to say something, but that's not a problem until next month. So thank you everyone. Bye-bye.